Let me start tonight by just giving you another quote out of Walden. It's from a chapter called Where I Lived and What I Lived For. And the quote, if I can remember it right, says this. He says, I know of no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability of mankind to elevate his life through a conscious endeavor. I'll say it again. I didn't get it wrong, but I want to emphasize it. I know of no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability of mankind to elevate his life through a conscious endeavor. In my mind, that is a hope-filled statement. It's the kind of statement and awareness that makes people happy. And the reason they're happy is because they're progressing. They're finding ways to improve and do things better and fix their situations. And it's just a really hope-filled statement. You should memorize it and say it to yourself every day, maybe several times a day, until it finally sinks and you come to realize that if you want to get somewhere, you can do it. But there's got to be an endeavor. You can't just hope, you can't just wish it here. You got to want it bad enough to go get it. I think I grew up with an example of that in my own father and mother. I think I've told you that when they first got married, they ended up, it was kind of a miserable first year that they had living with one of my dad's brothers and his wife in the same house, and they weren't the same. They weren't very compatible. They didn't have the same values and habits. And anyway, my mother in particular had kind of a bad experience, and she didn't talk about it too much, but when she did, you could kind of tell that it bothered her. Kind of brought her to tears a few times, wondering if there was going to be any hope, any future to the new marriage that she'd entered into. And I've tried to put myself in her situation a little bit, and I'm pretty sure that she had an influence on my dad to take a chance on the farm that he bought. It was a farm out in Lanark, Idaho that somebody else had bought earlier and tried to make a go of it and make payments on it. It wouldn't pay for itself, and so they had to turn it back to the bank. And somehow my dad and his new bride, my mother, both of them with just 8th grade educations, and they weren't 8th graders, but they were I forget, 22-year-olds, 23. Maybe when they had this thought to buy the ranch or buy the farm, I guess is a better word for it. And it was 112 acres, and they talked about it and decided that they'd take a chance on it and do it. And my dad was one of these people that could figure his way through things, even if he didn't have much of a chance up front. And I think that's what happened here. After they bought it, he and my mother went to work for another rancher about, I'd say 20 miles away, in a place called, not 20 miles if you went through the hills, but on the roads, it'd be about 20 miles. And it was It was a place called Nownan, Idaho, and the ranch was the Budge Ranch. And it was quite a large ranch on the Bear River, but it went clear up into the mountains, and they had rangeland, and it was quite a large ranch for that particular area. There are bigger ranches elsewhere, I'm sure. But they worked there, and as they worked there, they each had their own duties. My dad helped a lot with the ranch work and the cattle and the sheep and the farming and all that, the hay that had to be cut and put up, the branding of the cattle and all of those kinds of things. And my mother worked in the kitchen. And the reason she worked in the kitchen is because my dad wasn't the only ranch hand there. They had several ranch hands hired to run that big of a ranch. And she worked in the kitchen, and she was the cook for the ranch people when they'd come in at lunchtime, and she had to have a meal ready for them. And I don't remember ever saying if there was another lady that helped her. I think there probably was. But they both had jobs. Well, it so happens that in that same year they had this farm to pay for that they bought, and they found out that in order to do it, they'd need to make payments every year, and they started thinking through it, and they come to realize that it was going to be forever. If they made those payments, they'd never own that ranch or that farm. And so they doubled down and tried to work the farm and do the ranch work at that ranch too, and just do what they could to make it go. And my brother, my oldest brother, was born to them during that time. In fact, I may be getting just a little ahead of myself because it may have been 2 or 3 years before they actually decided to buy it after they were married, rather than just a short time, because he was going to school when they worked at the Budge Ranch, and he would be dropped off at my grandparents' house, and then he would go out to the Budge Ranch. And my dad and mom worked out there for quite a few years and got to know the people. And anyway, they accumulated enough money that they could make payments on this farm that they had bought faster than the schedule said they had to. And long story short on that is they had the ranch paid off in 5 years, which flabbergasted everybody that knew anything about the farm. I guess they were thinking that they would never make it on the farm to pay that off, and they didn't. They worked on the side, and both of them worked, and they had to sacrifice being away from my oldest brother because they needed the income, and he needed to go to school, and they let him stay with my grandparents to take care of him during the week. Anyway, so they were working both places, and I don't have a day-to-day of it or even a year-to-year, but I've heard them talk about it, and I've heard my older siblings talk about it. It was a hardship for them, but they were just so delighted to have their own farm and have it paid for as quickly as they did. Now, let me explain what it was they had paid for, because I did get in on some of that. What they had paid for was 112 acres, and it was mostly tumbleweeds and not what you'd call crop ground. But there was water rights to the property and a couple of ditches that came down from different directions. One entered the property from the south more and one from the west. and they were each about a mile away from the canal where the water head gate was pulled to let the water down to the property to water and irrigate crops with. And by the time it got down there on both ditches, there was hardly anything there, a trickle. It just was not enough to flood anything, and that's how they were doing it, trying to flood, irrigate, put a dam in the ditch, and usually a canvas dam in the ditch, and back the water up till it would come out of a cut in the ditch and out onto the crops, and then move the dam down further and try to water it. In both of those ditches, there wasn't enough water to amount to anything. But they tended the water carefully and tried to make it work. Well, it did a little bit. Here and there, they could find places to make it work. But I can remember my dad asking me to go irrigate over there with a shovel while he was off working another job. And it was almost impossible to make that water go where you wanted it to and actually do some good. Those alfalfa roots were up to a foot deep. And it takes a pretty good amount of water, and you have to have enough of it to let it soak and push down. And he used to always say, water the dry spots, and the low spots, or the high spots and the low spots will take care of themselves. I found that to be true. It's kind of the way it is in life, isn't it? We take care of the problem areas. Some of those others will take care of themselves over time. Well, back to this statement that I read from Thoreau about elevating your life through a conscious endeavor. My dad had his head going all this time, and he was trying to think, okay, what can I do? And there was kind of a slough that ran down through the property, and he found out that there was 2 or 3 places along the slough where it was kind of seeping out of the hill on one side. And he got somebody with a backhoe to come in and dig those areas out. One in particular. And I can remember him being excited to see the water accumulate in that big hole that they dug out, because he had plans for that. They had just come out with sprinkler pipes, aluminum sprinkler pipes. And his plan for that was that if he could somehow get a tractor and a little pump that runs off of a power takeoff on a tractor and get some sprinkler pipes, that he could maybe put the intake hose in that hole that he dug and get enough water to suck up in the pipe. And then you had to prime it, I remember, and then it would come out, open a valve, and it would come out the discharge hose into the sprinkler pipes. I'll never forget the first time he tried it. We only had maybe 5 or 6 heads, 5 or 6 pipe, each with a head on it. They stood up about 3 feet tall. It's kind of a rainbird type head. And I'll never forget the excitement that both he and my mother felt when they first threw that intake hose into that hole that they dug down in the slough. And there was enough water there that it could be sucked up by the tractor and the pump and into those pipes. And actually, there was enough pressure there to get those rainbirds going around and around and around. And they saw an opportunity to be able to move the water onto the crops and actually make it grow something where they'd never seen it before. They were just excited. You couldn't help but feel their excitement, because everything they'd worked for, all that sacrifice that they'd made, they could now see it at least having the potential to pay off, to become something, to be better than it was before. One didn't have to be tumbleweeds, and there were squirrels everywhere when they first bought the farm. One of my jobs was to go trap squirrels along all the fence lines for years. I did that to try to cut down the squirrels because they would just eat the crops as fast as they'd grow. And it was hard. It was hard for them to do all that and then lose their crop for one reason or another, either squirrels or crops or whatever. Sometimes the geese would come in on a grain crop and eat the crop up in one night. And they struggled with that. It was kind of like being on the frontier, I think, a little bit, because there was times when they just had all kinds of hope, and then there were letdowns. But they had that belief, they held that same belief that I quoted from Thoreau, and that is that they knew of no more encouraging fact that they could elevate their life through a conscious endeavor. They were engaged in that conscious endeavor all the while I was growing up in their home as their child, and I got to be a part of it and see it. So eventually, instead of 5 or 6 pipe, they were able to get a few more pipe. And so eventually it might run 10 or 12 pipe. And you had to move it every 12 hours or whatever. But at least you could get the water where it had never been before, and you could plant crops where they weren't before. And it was fun to watch. It's fun to watch the excitement. Well, we did that for a while. Kept trying to clean the ditches so that we could flood irrigate wherever we could. And then my dad found out that sometimes the slough would go dry, so he'd actually sometimes turn his irrigation stream into the slough and let it run down the slough and into this hole. And then he'd pump it out and could make better use of the water doing that sometimes than he could getting it down the ditch. So he was always trying to find a new angle to make things work. It wasn't too long after that he started talking to my neighbor who had a farm just to the east of us, and he had a similar problem, and they butted their heads together. And I wasn't there when they decided all this, but between the two of them, they thought, something, if we could get a power line over here, have the power company run. They'd have to set some telephone poles and run the line over for maybe a half mile or more. But if they do that we could actually use something similar in the bottom part of that slough down where they could both benefit from it, and they could have electrical pumps put in rather than the power takeoff pumps that went in the tractor, because you had to pay electricity, but not as much as you had to put through a tractor and the wear and tear on the tractor and the gasoline that it took. So can you see what I'm saying? He was always trying to elevate his situation with that farm and trying to make it just a little bit better next year than it was the last year. And where he had 6 pipe, he'd get 12. And eventually down after he got this power line put in with his neighbor and was able to use it, he dug another hole down there and was able to get the pump intake into it. And that pump was big enough that it would throw enough water that we could put like 30 pipe on and run it clear down through the farm where we'd never had water before. And to sit and watch that, especially in the evening sun when the spray pattern of the sprinklers could be seen against the sunlight, it was just inspiring, and it thrilled him. Yet it was still a lot of hard work because you had to move those pipe now, and you had to do it before and after your regular job, and you had to try to milk cows and feed the hay that you did produce to the cows and make it work. And we started out with just a few cows and then got more. Eventually ended up with a lot of it came after I had left the house, but he got to where there was like 40 or 50 cows. And I started with just a half a dozen or less. I can remember one time that he decided to get some good bloodlines into his herd, and so he bought 5 really choice heifers. He called them Frisian heifers because they were about ready to have calves and start milking, and at that time they cost $250 each. And that's nothing nowadays, but back in those days that was top dollar for cows. But he knew that he had to get the bloodlines into his herd, or he would not be able to get the milk production. He would just be feeding the cows without getting the milk production that he thought he could get. So again, he was trying to find a different angle and a better way. And I learned from watching his example. And when I started reading Thoreau, and I read that statement about knowing of no more encouraging fact than elevating your life through a conscious endeavor, I couldn't help but think of his life and everything that he did to try to make it better. And before I got out of high school, all 112 acres of that, except for a little pasture land here and there that was too boggy, too wet to call farmland, he had the whole thing under production. And I'm sure the people that had bought that farm and couldn't make it work earlier, before my mom and dad bought it, would have been amazed. And it was just because he knew he could, and he went to work to prove it. And that little farm, small as it was, ended up being the base to his whole income and family and everything, even though he had some outside jobs that he worked with. It was the farm that he counted on the most. Eventually he got to where he could buy some better equipment, some tractors and plows that could dig deeper and root out the old alfalfa roots and different weeds and discs and whatnot, so that he could, when he did plant the crops, they would grow better. Well, there were still setbacks like frosts and hailstorms and things like that caused problems. But I will never forget his determination to elevate his life through a conscious endeavor. And it didn't just apply to his farm. It applied to his life. It applied to the way he worked with my mother, the way he treated her. She had some wonderful things to say about him when he passed away, about how she trusted him always, and that he never disappointed or let down that trust that she always had in him. And part of that trust was knowing that he'd provide for her, not just materially, but spiritually, and with the raising of their family, and doing the best they could to help them out and get them on their way, help them to find their pathway through life. But I haven't got time to go into all that right tonight, but you really can elevate your life through a conscious endeavor. And I think you can do it even if you're handicapped. My dad was handicapped in some ways because he didn't have ditches coming to his property that would provide the water that he needed. But he found a way to solve it. And I think of people that have physical handicaps. And I'm amazed at some people that can just keep pushing ahead, whether they're missing one of their limbs or have other kind of issues that go on. They work at elevating it. It's not so much where you are on the ladder, should we say, but but whether you're climbing up, whether you're reaching for the next rung. And there's something very encouraging about that. And once you get to that next rung, there's always a one above that. And it becomes a challenge. And at the same time, it's not just a challenge, it's a reward. It's what brings happiness, whether it's physical or spiritual. That next rung makes you happy. If you neglect to reach up and grab it, you'll never feel that happiness. I've come to realize that, not just through their example, but through my own experience. And I was thinking, life is a little bit like a stairway. You can go up the stairs or you can come down the stairs. And generally speaking, you're either going forward on a path or you're backpedaling eventually, because if you just become stagnant. Another place in the Rose book, he says, the idle mind is a devil's workshop. And so if you got your mind thinking about how to elevate yourself rather than just trashy stuff or nothing at all, then you can make progress. Particularly if you dedicate what you're doing to a good cause and ask for the Lord's help. And just keep working. It's not gifted. It was never intended to be gifted. I kind of got a kick out of my mother-in-law because they had what they call, maybe they still do, what they call a publisher's clearinghouse giveaway. And if you subscribe to so many magazines and did this or that, I don't even know what you had to do for sure. You had to play their game, I guess is the way I'd say it. And then they'd lead you to believe that maybe you'd be the one that got the drawing, and they'd bring them $1 million or $500,000 or whatever it was to your door, 100,000, and you could have a chance to win that. My mother-in-law had so many magazines just because she figured it was she was gonna strike it rich someday. And I found out that it's not the way the Lord intends you to do it anyway. And besides that, it's not going to happen because it's just a gimmick. And the real value, the happiness comes in seeing the progress from going to ditch to 3 or 4 sprinkler pipes to 10 or 12 to electric, from gas-fed pumps to electric pumps to 30, 40 sprinklers and onward and upward from there, and machinery, whatever, like my dad did. Well, if you can learn from his experience like I did, and remember Thoreau's statement about elevating your life through a conscious endeavor, you'll be just fine. But you have to be like those horses that we had on the farm. When the horse flies were flying all around their heads and they were throwing their heads up and trying to get rid of them, the sweat was coming down. We found out that the only way we could get them to do much was to put blinders on them. Well, blinders were part of the bridle that went, they had padded things that went like that on both sides of your eyes. So the only way you could look was straight ahead. And that's kind of the way we have to be. We have to not get distracted. Stay focused on what really matters. And the other thing that my dad would testify to if he were here today, and that is, it wasn't the sprinkler pipes that really mattered. It wasn't them going from 5 to 12, and eventually he baled the hay and eventually got round balers, so he was always trying to improve in the way that he put hay up too, because it was loose and then it was baled hay and then it was round balers, and he found ways to put the hay up so it wouldn't spoil in the wintertime when we had so much snow. But what he would tell you is that it wasn't all of that he was really after. What he was really after is a good life and a good family. Well, I'm sure I probably disappointed him somewhat, but I think I brought him pleasure in some ways too. And I'm going to use his example and try to stay focused, because believe me, there's things that I need to stay focused on. I'm aware of them. I've made some strides, but I got more to make, and I have the need to be focused on a conscious endeavor to elevate my life. There, that's today's verbiage. The example comes from my dad mostly, and the verbiage comes from me. But maybe between the two of us, we can make the point, and you can give my dad most of the credit. How's that? He loves you as much as I do. Good night.